It's 1995, legendary Windows 95 is released, a new $100 bill enters circulation, the president of Russia continues to amuse the world, and charming Salma Hayek makes her first appearance on the big screen. In general, it was just an ordinary year, full of good and bad things. With so much going on, a small research experiment in Norway could just simply get lost. But because of this experiment, there was a possibility that there would be no famous Salma Hayek snake dance next year, or there could be no next year at all. A scientific rocket launched from Norway and an incredible coincidence of events led the world to the brink of a nuclear war as close as never before. On that date, the fate of all mankind depended on the decision of one person: Boris Yeltsin. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the United States conducted the world's first nuclear weapon test. The use of atomic weapons made it possible to end the World War the same year.
Это секрет атомной бомбы, хотя этого секрета давно уже не существует.
But 4 years later, a nuclear explosion at the Semipalatinsk test site in the USSR marked the end of the US monopoly on a nuclear weapon. Since that time, any crisis or conflict that involved the USSR and the United States could turn into a global nuclear war. Fortunately, leaders of both superpowers were aware that the use of nuclear weapons could have catastrophic consequences not only for the enemy but also for the entire population of the world. Thus, even during the most acute international crisis, the East and the West were able to find a compromise solution without bringing the situation to a critical point. But sometimes they've been to this point very close. And it is interesting that speaking about nuclear crisis, people will often remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Some might remember the Soviet Stanislav Petrov's incident in 1983, but it's less often that anyone will remember the so-called Norwegian rocket incident. However, during this barely known incident, the world got to a nuclear war as close as ever before. What is even more interesting, this happened not during a military conflict, not even during a Cold War, but in a relatively peaceful time, when it seemed that the threat of a nuclear war was already in the past. In 1945, trying to save personnel and research facilities built during the Second World War, Canada created the so-called Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, or CARDE. CARDE started to work in one of the most promising areas of that time, rocket technologies. The first result of the department's work was Canadian anti-tank rockets and air-to-air missiles created in the early 1950s. But soon the department was given a task to develop an anti-ballistic missile to protect Canada against Soviet nuclear rockets. In 1957, a device called the Propulsion Test Vehicle was created to study various engine designs and new types of fuels. Its first launch took place 2 years later in 1959. Although these studies did not lead to the development of any specific projects of anti-ballistic missiles, the result of this work was the world-famous sounding rocket Black Brant. The first model of this rocket could carry 68 kilograms to a height of 150 kilometers. But since the 1960s, a series of various rocket modifications have been developed. So, for example, the latest model, Black Brant 12, has a payload between 100 and 400 kilograms with the flight height of 1500 kilometers. This is even higher than the orbit of space shuttles and the ISS, but one of the most important characteristics of this rocket is its exceptional reliability. Out of more than 1000 launches of this Canadian rocket, less than 2% were unsuccessful. This made the Black Brant one of the most reliable rockets in history. Due to its excellent characteristics and high reliability, the Black Brant became one of the most popular and highly demanded research rockets for physical, astrophysical, chemical, and biomedical researches during suborbital flights. The Canadian Space Agency and NASA have used this rocket successfully many times for their experiments, and the launch of the rocket from Norway, scheduled for January 25, 1995, should not have been an exception either. It was a part of Norwegian-US joint research project to study the Northern Lights. On that day, the rocket launched successfully and was about to become the 607th launch of the Black Brant from the Norwegian rocket range Andøya. But the celebration of the successful launch was interrupted by a phone call. The head of the rocket range, Kolbjørn Adelson, picked up the phone and found in horror that the launch of their rocket almost started a nuclear war. The 1990s was a time of significant changes. the fall of the Berlin Wall, one of the most striking Cold War symbols, launched a series of irreversible events in Germany and other countries, which eventually led to a complete deconstruction of the communist system in Europe. It seemed like the Cold War was finally over, and US troops began to withdraw from West Germany, while endless trains with Soviet tanks that used to terrify Europe began to move to the east. Both the final withdrawal of Soviet troops and the last parade in Germany were conducted literally and figuratively by the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. It is worth mentioning that Yeltsin's reputation in the world was slightly ambiguous, to put it mildly. The Western world hailed his role in the collapse of the USSR, the launch of various economic reforms, and his attempts to transform Russia into a modern democratic society, but at the same time it was difficult to ignore, let's call them, weird situations with the Russian president that were often a result of Yeltsin's addiction to alcohol.
Я просто проспал.
The attitude towards Yeltsin was quite uncertain in Russia as well. Actually, the whole situation in Russia was extremely uncertain. By 1995, most of the famous Western brands have already entered the Russian market, meanwhile Western democracy seemed wouldn't take roots on Russian soil. The political situation was quite unstable. Less than 2 years have passed since the so-called constitutional crisis that caused more than 100 deaths. In 1995, in addition to serious political and economic problems, the situation in Chechnya was getting worse. On top of that, Russia had a big blow on its international prestige. Despite the release of tension and the end of the Cold War, NATO announced a possible expansion to the east by inviting countries of the former Warsaw Pact and some Soviet republics. Despite Russia's objections, it turned out that Russian opinion did not matter anymore, especially for NATO, since Russia wasn't even its member. For Russia, this blow was extremely painful, especially for the Russian military. It suddenly turned out that the Cold War and the tensions between the West and the East were still there, so it was perfect timing for an unknown rocket to appear on the screens of Russian military radars. On January 25, 1995, at about 9:30 a.m., several radars of the Russian missile warning system detected an unknown object. In fact, it was unknown only for the Russian military. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway twice on December 25th and January 16th notified more than 30 countries, including Russia, about the upcoming launch of the sounding rocket from the Norwegian rocket range Andøya. The notification included the launch site's location and the areas where the rocket would drop its stages, but did not indicate the exact date and time, as they depended on weather conditions. This was a common practice at the time, but for unknown reasons the notification was not communicated to the Russian military, or at least to the personnel of the radar stations. Therefore, the unknown missile caused quite a reasonable concern among the Russian military. One of the problems was that it was impossible to determine the exact launch site, but only an estimated area with an error of several dozen miles. But the worst thing was that the assumed location of the launch was similar to one of the most probable scenarios of missile attack. At that moment, everything looked like a launch of a ballistic missile from a nuclear submarine in the Norwegian Sea. I should say that the Black Brant launched from Norway on that day was not quite an ordinary sounding rocket. This was Model 12, a huge 15-meter 4-stage rocket, so no wonder that by observing an object that moved at high speed on a high trajectory with stages being separated, Russian radar operators could confuse it with a war missile. All the characteristics appeared similar to the US Navy submarine-launched Trident missile. During the first stage of its flight, the rocket's trajectory looked as if an estimated flight range was around 3 or 3,500 kilometers, which made Moscow a possible target. Of course, a single missile did not look like a massive attack, but one possibility was that the rocket had been a solitary missile with a radar-blocking EMP payload in order to blind Russian radars in the first stage of a surprise attack. In this scenario, gamma rays from a high-altitude nuclear detonation would create a very high-intensity electromagnetic pulse that would confuse radars and incapacitate electronic equipment, which then makes it possible to deliver a massive nuclear attack on Russia without retaliation. Therefore, strictly following instructions, the missile warning radar personnel immediately notified the General Headquarters about the missile threat. The threat was taken quite seriously. All Russian strategic missile forces were put on full alert. The automatic system for the command and control of Russia's strategic nuclear forces named Kazbek was activated. The system is controlled through the portable terminal Cheget, better known as nuclear briefcase. The Russian president was informed of a possible missile threat, so Boris Yeltsin activated his terminal. It was the first and the only time in the history that the leader of one of the nuclear states activated his briefcase. At that moment, just one push of a button was holding the world from a nuclear apocalypse. According to the instructions of that time, the president of Russia had no more than 10 minutes to make a decision about a nuclear retaliation. This is exactly the time a hostile nuclear missile needed to reach the Russian territory and destroy its objects. In addition to Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase, two more similar terminals were used during the incident, one by Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, the other was by Chief of General Staff Mikhail Kolesnikov. The terminal users communicated via telephone conference call. No one knows for sure what exactly they discussed. Some sources believe that Russian leaders realized right away that there was no threat at all. Other sources claim that the Russian defense minister insisted on a missile strike on the United States and Norway. Fortunately, Boris Yeltsin did not make any hasty decisions. Approximately on the 8th minute of the incident, Yeltsin was informed that the missile was moving away from Russia and did not pose any threat. 8 minutes out of the 10. On that day, the world was only 2 minutes away from a possible nuclear war. It is the tight timing that makes the Norwegian incident special. Acute crises between the two superpowers happened before, but they had a much longer build-up. Therefore, leaders had enough time to make an informed decision. However, during the Norwegian incident, Boris Yeltsin was put in an incredibly difficult situation when he had only a few minutes to make an extremely difficult decision whether to act or withhold. That is why many consider the Norwegian incident as one of the most dangerous in history. And interestingly, the closest the world was to a nuclear apocalypse was not during the Cold War, when the tension between the USA and the USSR was at its peak, not during the Berlin or Cuban crisis, not during multiple proxy wars in the Middle East or Asia, but at a relatively peaceful time and as a result of absurd coincidence. And unfortunately, that means that the risk of a nuclear war has never disappeared and is still there. It is hard to imagine what could have happened if an incident like this took place today, when the word common sense has long been inapplicable to some state leaders. But let's hope for the best and that the nuclear war will only remain in animated videos. And that's the story. If you're interested in stories like this, watch my video about Fidel Castro and a $10 bill that may have dramatically changed the American-Cuban relations. That's all for now. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye. And guess my accent if you can.